Good evening once again. I'm Ali Velshi in for Brian Williams. Day 170 of the Biden administration. There's new urgency tonight in the battle to protect voting rights. Efforts to stop Republican-controlled states from restricting access to the ballot are now gaining momentum following the recent Supreme Court ruling that upheld new election laws in Arizona and the success of Senate Republicans in blocking federal voting rights legislation. Now, leaders of national civil rights groups are stepping up pressure on the White House. Late today, they met President Biden and Vice President Harris in a private session to lay out what they plan to do to safeguard the right to vote.
Democracy is under vigorous, vicious, and sinister attack, beginning with the events of January 6th at the Capitol and cascading like a tsunami through state legislatures across the nation.
We are going to build a movement around this country to resist that. What is clearly a move to try and disenfranchise people of color from voting. The methodical way this has been laid out in these state legislators and in their state legislation is geared toward robbing us of the vote. The movement from the ground up is starting to be the only way that we can preserve our right to vote. We informed them that this is going to come not from the White House down, but from our houses up.
According to the Brennan Center for Justice, since January, 48 states have introduced at least 389 bills to restrict voting. 17 states have signed 28 new laws curbing access to the vote. Another 61 bills are moving through 18 other state legislatures. And today, the Texas legislature opened a special session to revive the Republican-backed election bills that Democrats killed in May by staging a walkout in the last moments of the regular session. The proposed Texas legislation includes banning 24-hour and drive-through voting, new voter ID requirements for mail-in ballots, and expanding the powers of partisan poll watchers. Democrats in the Texas legislature gathered in front of the State House today, vowing to again push back.
We are here because we will not be silent. Friends, we will not back down. We will not back out. That's right. And we will not back up because we're defiant. We will defy the push to suppress our votes because we believe in protecting the right to vote for all Texans.
Ashley, I want to start with you, and I want to start with something that Charlie Sykes wrote about in the Bulwark about the GOP and voting restrictions. He says, I hope Democrats are not putting too much confidence in the Biden economy. The infrastructure bill will overcome these social issues as well as the attack on the elections, because this is something that the GOP is completely behind, and the base is very motivated and very fired up to do, which I can't remember anything quite like this. He's saying the GOP is fully behind this voter suppression, voter restriction stuff, and the economy and infrastructure be damned for now.
He's not entirely, or he's not wrong. Rather, first of all, speaking more generally to his broader point, cultural issues, and you could put the voting restrictions into that, are incredibly important in the Republican Party. And you're seeing from former President Trump, him harping on things like critical race theory and thinking that those are winners for his party. They're not talking about the economy. And then he is absolutely right on the outsized role that voting restrictions are playing in the Republican Party, because it is something that the base is deeply fired up about. Former President Trump has perpetuated this false, dangerous, and baseless claim that the election was somehow stolen. That's not true, but about 30% of Republicans believe that. A huge swath of his base believes that. And then even Republicans who don't believe that so-called big lie, even Republicans who are getting pushed out of their local parties because they dared to say that President Biden is the legitimate president, even they say, well, our voters don't trust elections, and therefore we need more restrictions. But it's this sort of circular logic, because their voters don't trust elections because former President Trump keeps on saying the election was stolen. And so in that manner, you have almost the entire Republican Party, from sort of MAGA Nation to even more moderate Republicans, saying that, yes, these restrictions, these voter laws are something that we absolutely support, and they think are good for them politically.
And Melissa, there was a court document from a hearing for somebody who had been detained for their involvement in January 6th, with the Justice Department actually not only citing Donald Trump's role, but the fact that right-leaning media accentuates those claims. It reads as follows. Former President Trump continues to make false claims about the election, continues to insinuate that he may be reinstalled in the near future without another election, and minimize the violent attacks on the Capitol. Television networks continue to carry and report on those claims. And to Ashley's point, this is how the big lie becomes the big fact.
No, that's exactly right, Ali. And it's not just that we're seeing this in the media, and certainly the right-wing media. We've also seen it credited at the Supreme Court. Just last week in the Brnovich decision, that was a legal challenge to 2 Arizona voting restrictions, the Supreme Court seemed to credit the idea that there was a true threat of voter fraud that needed to be addressed by the states, and that states could take steps through more restrictive laws to address claims of voter fraud. So even at the highest echelons of the courts, we're seeing that this big lie is in fact becoming embedded as a big fact. And that's fueling more and more legislation, more and more restrictive legislation that will make it harder for voters to go to the polls and vote.
Jonathan, let's talk about voter rights and the civil rights group that met with the president today and the vice president. They're making it clear. You heard Reverend Al say that they are starting a movement from the ground up to stop the erosion of voting rights. What impact does that have? The fact that those civil rights leaders, most of whom are allied with the White House in the first place, what difference does it make that they went there and they sat with the president and the vice president and said, this has to stop and we need your help?
Well, I wrote on this today, and there's been immense frustration among certain quarters of Democrats and liberals and civil rights groups about the lack of real leadership from the White House on this issue. They point to how committed President Biden was to COVID relief and now to this infrastructure bill in both tracks, the bipartisan agreement and the reconciliation part of it. And yet there hasn't been an outward real push on this, which many Democrats feel is a sort of the existential threat facing not just their party, but democracy itself. Sure, we've heard from the president occasionally on the issue, but aides have kept pushing that there will be a big speech, there'll be a big rollout on this, and that hasn't happened yet. Now, though we're reporting tonight, this could happen as soon as next week, perhaps as early as Tuesday, the president giving a speech on the matter. And today he did meet with these civil rights groups. We also saw the vice president talk about this. She's leading the administration's response on issues of voting rights, and she announced today that the DNC will be giving $25 million towards the issue. But for many, it's not quite enough. They want the president to really lean in on this. But White House aides feel somewhat frustrated as to what they can do. They can do the math in the Senate as anybody else. They don't really see a chance for sweeping federal election reform there. They don't see any voting rights bills getting passed without changing or eliminating the filibuster, and yet there are Democrats, Manchin and Sinema, senators among them, who don't want to do that. So short of that, their focus now, aides are telling us, is really going to be more on legal challenges, on state by state. The Department of Justice will be involved. Also, of course, we will see them next year trying to really boost turnout and trying to just drive people to the polls like they did. They point to 2020 and being able to have a high turnout during the pandemic. They think they can do that again. But of course, we all know that's harder in the midterms. And there is real concern among Democrats inside and outside of the West Wing that these restrictions put in place by Republicans will hurt Democrats significantly at the ballot box next year and could cost them control of one, if not both, houses of Congress.